Hello! Today I'm taking a look into the intricacies of Final Fantasy's game design, with a look at the levelling systems, and more specifically their accompanying character development systems in several of its marquee titles. Now, much like my recent episode discussing significant weapons in Cloud Strife's arsenal, this is a top 5 that's aimed more as a case study in RPG system design, rather than something overtly subjective about aesthetics or personal favourites or anything like that. And I think it's a good vehicle to understand how and why certain mechanics work, and conversely, how perhaps others don't. So, with that aside, let's jump right in, and firstly, just to frame levelling systems in the context of Final Fantasy, this is an aspect of RPG design closely bound to battle system design, and where I've previously categorised Final Fantasy as comprised of 3 key factors: action, exploration, and exposition, this is very much the arena of action. It's the most involved and onerous aspect of player input, and it is the increasing complexity of enemies and battles that obstructs our progression through the world and story, so the exploration and exposition factors, that necessitates the player to grind, level, and upgrade their characters in the games. So overall, it's a very important aspect of the games that is applied in many different ways, and interrelates to other things such as weapons, character classes and base stats, and abilities. And kicking off, I'd like to discuss Final Fantasy VI first, since this, along with Final Fantasy IV, and indeed other RPGs outside of Final Fantasy, they each employ what we might call a more standard or traditional levelling system. And what I mean by that is that characters in the battle party gain experience points, which contributes to them levelling up, usually in a way that's preset to their character class and unique attributes bound to that. So, taking Terra as an example in Final Fantasy VI, she has a high base level of magic, and as we level, she proceeds to become among the more powerful magic wielders in the game, and unlocks relevant abilities particular to this class, such as different spells. Likewise, we have characters like Sabin, who have extremely high strength and stamina, and as we level him, he unlocks abilities particular to these attributes, such as his blitz commands. So that's a prime example to kick off with in my first instance around how levelling systems function in their most fundamental sense. And I think it's an intuitive format from which to launch a game and introduce a player to the core elements of RPG. But for those seeking more advanced or player-determinate levelling options and character customization, some of the other Final Fantasy games may have proved more dynamic or enjoyable to them. So on this note, moving on, I'd next like to discuss Final Fantasy VII, and this is likewise broadly modelled on the traditional level up conventions, with characters having preset base stats and levelling milestones which experience points build up. But a key addition here is how the game handles magic or materia, and how the materia itself can be levelled and applied to a character. So on the one hand, this is evidence of how Square was starting to break Final Fantasy out of the RPG mould of having set character classes, since any of our party can now be equipped with materia, magic and summons, and thus becoming wielders of magic. And class mechanics is perhaps a conversation for another day, but crucially, levelled materia is something that works in conjunction with character stats to determine its overall effectiveness and power, and its efficiency at levelling roots back to what equipment it's slotted into. So again, as I covered in my recent episode on Cloud's weapons, some weapons in the game offer double growth for materia, for example, which is very advantageous to quickly level certain magics and become more powerful. So overall, it's a very nuanced example of how equipment, levelling and magic interrelates in Final Fantasy VII, and how the player has some degree of input in customization with what materia and equipment combinations they choose to pair up their character with, and the resulting benefits that they may have with that. It's also prudent to note the distinguishing feature of unique character limit breaks in Final Fantasy VII, which, unlike random desperation maneuvers, were also battle elements that were able to level in their own particular way, namely on how often they were used in battle in the earliest instances. So, for example, Cloud's Braver, if we use that a certain number of times, we would unlock the cross-slash limit break, and so on. So next up, I want to look at Final Fantasy VIII and its infamous approach to levelling, or at least how it sought to augment levelling and boost character stats with its unique junctioning system. And this system has been criticised by a lot of fans, which we'll touch on shortly, but it's an example of how Square have always sought to push the envelope with RPG design, and where character levelling at its core remains often the same and quite homogeneous across the games. There's usually something else, a little more player-determined and a little more customizable along with it, whether that's materia growth, as we've just touched on, or junctioning, or whatever it might be. And in Final Fantasy VIII, several things are able to level up. We have the characters themselves, as we might expect. We have the enemies that scale alongside our characters, which was also a huge criticism levelled at this game. And we have our summonable Guardian forces, which level and unlock abilities for us too. So although I understand the criticism, I think Final Fantasy VIII is a fascinating case study in RPG design, and a series of several moving parts and components when it came to boosting characters and progressing, that, while ambitious and principally sound in many ways, don't quite ultimately gel together. For example, the principle of summons being elevated to more than simply modes of attack and given their own statistics to level up and abilities to unlock for both themselves and characters, I thought was a really ambitious and novel approach that worked quite well. Turning to the characters, beyond the standard levelling, they are, much like Final Fantasy VII's materia levelling, further boosted by additional functions. But rather than anything specific to weapons, armour or accessories, which were largely stripped out, armour and accessories did away with in this game, boosting statistics was furnished by the Junction System. And on the one hand, what the Junction System did really well was commit to the lore and story of Final Fantasy VIII and the ideas around sorceresses, GFs and paramagic being derived from these core magical sources. And on the other hand, it recalibrated RPG conventions by making magic a stocked numerical item rather than something that was powered by a character's MP, and having the numbered magic contribute to the player's stats overall. So for example, you could have 100 Curagas junctioned to your HP, which would boost it by 300% or whatever it might be. And for critics, this was an issue because it disincentivizes the use of magic, because losing Curagas, using them in a battle, would diminish your HP buffs, and so on. Additionally, the fact that enemies level in tandem to the party also disincentivizes the desire to level up too much, because maintaining a low level and gaming the system by artificially boosting your stats through refining items and junctioning the magic to HP, strength, so on, makes Final Fantasy VIII an incredibly easy title for those who are inclined to do so. So as I say, I understand the criticism. I think the commitment to lore was admirable, and it was an ambitious addition to levelling that could work, but it just wasn't quite there, and I think there could be some relatively easy fixes for this. Perhaps I could dedicate an episode to how we fix the Junction System, but overall, I do maintain it had great potential, and I did like it, despite the counterintuitiveness of spellcasting and some little issues around that. But a prime example of Square's ambition to sort of push the envelope with RPG system design. Moving on, I next want to look at Final Fantasy XII, and what we've witnessed thus far in the Final Fantasy systems we've discussed is a continued effort by Square to balance RPG conventions of classes and stats growth with player agency and the freedom to customise their characters. And I've mentioned in the past this idea of bringing the character and not the class, and how instead of being beholden to a character's preset attributes, such as white mages, warriors or black mages, Square increasingly experimented with democratising abilities and attributes, such as Final Fantasy VII giving the freedom to anyone to equip magic, summons, and so on. And arriving at Final Fantasy XII, this is perhaps the most customisable system of character growth and levelling I think I've seen in a Final Fantasy to date, because everything from weapons we can use and accessories we can equip to magic and abilities is open to any one of our party members. And so the onus is very much on the player to compose and upskill their characters as they see fit. And actually, while I've encountered a fair few people who don't care much for Final Fantasy XII, the ensemble cast, the deeply political story, which is fair enough, I've also found that within this group there are several who found the license board actually quite a redemptive feature of the original gameplay, and they quite enjoyed the freedom that was offered there, to do this experimentation and build up their party how they saw fit. And I suppose at this juncture it is prudent to note that the Zodiac Age revisited the license board and made it much more of a job-based system, the likes of which we saw back in Final Fantasy III. And while I don't know the precise reasons behind doing that, the controlling and compartmentalising of player freedom leads me neatly onto my fifth and final growth system, which is that of Final Fantasy X. Now, while this top 5 is more a set of case studies, as I mentioned, I must admit that the sphere grid in Final Fantasy X is my favourite such system to feature in any Final Fantasy. And the reason for this is that, for me, it strikes a balance between player freedom to dictate their character's attributes and abilities, with the conventions of job classes and character archetypes that root back to the conventions of RPG, tabletop and video gaming, and of course the fantasy literary genre from which it derives. And the composition of the sphere grid is such that we have these compartmentalised areas that serve as start points for our party members, and they broadly correspond to class archetypes such as Black Mage for Lulu, Warrior stats for Tidus, Thief stats for Riku, and so on. Yet crucially, they are intersected and bridged together so that, if inclined, one could unlock Black Mage abilities for Tidus, Monk or Warrior abilities for Lulu, and so on, without compromising their class status within the story. And while I've never personally sought to power up Lulu's strength and make her more of a physical combatant, the fact that this is permissible and the player is free to do that, I really think that's cool, and it's only really summoning add-ons, which for the purposes of lore and story is contained to Yuna's character, that a player is really restricted from allocating around the party. And I discussed at length in my History of Final Fantasy Summons episode how the summons have increasingly become elevated within Final Fantasy stories to the centre stage and usually hinging around the central character. So there we have it, a brief top 5 that shows how Square has increasingly pursued this balance of gameplay and RPG convention, and how they bolt on unique features for character growth to complement and correspond with the necessities of levelling within a given game, usually appended as well to the story, so very interesting complex systems and how they bridge all these things together. If you got this far, kudos to you and thanks for listening. And drop a comment below, let me know your thoughts on the various systems and your favourites that comprise and advance Final Fantasy games and their characters.